and thank you for joining me today. I did say I did not think you had left at this point, but I also noted that here in Canada, it's actually a holiday. I'm not sure if anyone else is joining from Canada, but for those of you who are, thank you for also joining us on a holiday day. Okay, so I'm going to first share my slides and give everyone edit access. We'll be using these slides throughout the presentation and kind of co-editing them. So you're welcome to open them up. I'll also be sharing them on my screen. And this session, just make sure everyone knows where they are and what we're going to do. This session is called Restoring Pedagogy for the Post-Digital University. And so we're going to be doing a lot of storytelling. I do talk a bit, but a lot of it is you guys crafting stories, telling stories, sharing stories, comparing stories. So it's much more of a kind of active design for this workshop. So my access statement, I'm going to turn on captions. Okay, so I've things that I'm going to do in this session to try and make it more accessible so people are able to fully participate. I've turned on captioning in Zoom. Relevant visuals will be described. This is not a very image heavy presentation. There's not really diagrams, it's really more about storytelling. But when you are telling your own stories, if you do use images and put images in there, I do encourage you to actually describe the images as well. There is a little bit of theory in this presentation. So as I go through theory, if I use any terminology that is more advanced, technical or jargony, I will explain it. And if I start using terminology and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, stop me, ask me, tell me. I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page about what we're talking about here. In terms of participation, I know everyone probably has different ways they want to participate and engage in this session. So I invite you to participate whatever way you're comfortable. So you can unmute yourself and speak. We're a relatively small group, so that won't be disruptive. You can use the chat. Again, we're going to be co-editing these slides, so you can keep all of your participation in the slides. You can draw on the slides, you can put images on the slides, so you can participate that way. Or you can choose to just sort of listen and observe. There are parts that are sort of like chunks of time dedicated to telling stories, to crafting stories. And if you're not in the right headspace for that, you're also welcome to step away during those times. And then finally take breaks. Leave early if you need to, step away. It's a very fluid session. And I will apologize, I probably am sounding a little bit congested. I'm just coming out of a cold. Fortunately, we're on Zoom, so as far as I know, you can't spread germs over Zoom, but I might mute myself, have a little bit of a cough or a sneeze, so I will apologize in advance for that. Okay, so we will be using Google. I think most of you were in my sessions before, but I never like to make assumptions about technology and people's ability to use technology or comfort levels with technology. So I'm just going to do a very quick intro to using Google. For those of you who decide to participate in that way, I just want to make sure you have the tools and the knowledge that you need. So for this session, we will be doing some text editing in Google. To edit text in Google, I'm just going to put a shape here. You would simply double click on wherever you wanted to add the text. You should see like a flashing cursor, and then you can type text. I am going to ask you guys to create stories, and you can decide if you want your stories to just be text stories or if you want to use other forms of media, which means you may also wish to use images. So to add images in Google, in the menu bar, there's an insert option. You can insert an image, and it gives you multiple ways of inserting an image. One of the easiest would be to search the web. You can also upload from your own computer. You can access your own webcam. Today we're going to be talking a lot about networks. So let's put in an image of a spider web. And then once you do the image Google search, you'll see lots of images popping up. You can select the one that you like, drag and drop it into your slide. Typically, they come in really, really large. So around the image, there will be a blue border with little blue boxes. If you click on one of those, you can drag and resize your image. One of the activities we're going to be doing is networked storytelling. So it's actually creating connections between different elements on your slides. So again, in Google, what we'll be using are lines. So one of the menu options here shows a line, says line. If you click on that, you'll have different types of connectors that you can use. So I'm going to select the line connector, and it allows you to, when I now bring my mouse over an element, there are little purple circles around the element that I can click on as a node to connect this to something else. And then I can drag it and click somewhere else. So it will create a line connecting two elements on your screen. And if we need to, I can go over that again when we get there. But when we do our networked storytelling, we're going to put on lots of different elements onto our screens and draw those connections so we know how things impact each other. And then the only other thing that might be useful at this point is commenting. So comments are available in Google towards the top right. There's what looks like a little comment or text box. If you click on that, you will see another comment or text box with a plus. You can click on that and it will allow you to add a comment. So I apologize if this wasn't helpful. If you guys are all Google pros, I just, again, didn't want to make any assumptions. Okay, so that's the technical stuff out of the way. Now for the fun part, the disclosure for this session. So this session is really an experiment in collaborative storytelling. It's conceptual, it's incomplete. It's some ideas that are related to my own doctoral research and sort of how I'm wanting to examine systems of control and influence and shaping how we teach in our pedagogies. So as we go through, some of these activities might work really, really well, and some might not. So I will ask for your grace as we go through it, but also have fun with it. Let me know what's working and what's not working. And hopefully it will just be a good opportunity for us to get to know each other and to share our own stories. So the premises upon which this session and my research are built are that right now, higher education is at a turning point where new practices and cultures are being defined and normalized. So COVID was really a huge catalyst for this because we were forced to shift how we teach and how we think about teaching and learning spaces and environments and practices. But now, as we're kind of coming out of it to whatever degree we are, we're finding that we're making decisions on either we need to go back completely to the past and kind of forget everything that we've learned, or this is the new norm. And right now, if we're not having explicit conversations about what that looks like, we might end up with practices that don't necessarily reflect what we want education to be. The second premise is that teaching and learning occur at the center of a web of influences, visible and invisible, complementary and contradictory. So what that means, and for those of you who joined me previously in my hidden curriculum sessions, it really is linked to that. When we are in the classroom, when we teach, when our learners are there to learn, it may feel like the only things that are impacting what happens in the classroom are the learners and the teacher, but there are so many other things exerting influence on what happens in our teaching spaces, which might be policies from the institution or cultures from the institution or external expectations or motivations for what teaching is, or external accrediting bodies, or the technologies that we use, or all of these many, many myriad of things that impact what actually happens in that classroom. And so part of what we're going to do is map some of those influences and look at those networks that exert what actually happens in those spaces. Which takes us to number 3 is it's only through actually understanding all those influences, through revealing that web, that we can understand why our practices are the way they are and how we can actually deliberately shape them to be what we want them to be. So then the next thing is part of what we're going to be doing today is looking at speculation and looking at how do we imagine better futures. But in order to do that, we need to understand what's happening now. So we need to understand the present to write the future. And then finally, underlying everything we're going to talk about today is that storytelling, the act of storytelling, is a radical act. It's an act of reflection, provocation, and disruption. So we're going to use stories to do a lot of this work for us. Okay, so that was a lot of talking, a lot of premises. So I'm going to jump into my story. And this is sort of what brings me to this work, and a bit about my own educational background. So I have been a student pretty much my entire life. I have gone through multiple programs in multiple countries. And in navigating educational systems, I've never really experienced any barriers to education. I've always found education, and this is not a flex, I've always found education really, really easy for me in navigating these systems. And it wasn't until my current program, it wasn't until the start of COVID that I realized that the reason why wasn't because, oh my God, I'm so brilliant. The reason why is because I've always navigated educational systems that were designed for students like me. I am a white cisgendered woman. I'm a citizen of Canada. I speak English fluently in a preferred accent. I come from a very stable family structure. I come from a good socioeconomic background. I am able-bodied. I generally have never really experienced or been situated in a place where these systems were not really designed to make my life easier. And in recognizing that, I realized that that's not actually the case for everyone. A lot of our systems are designed in a way that disadvantages so many people that are not those kind of homogenized, normalized students the systems are designed for. And it was only really in the past couple of years that I've started to recognize that and started to realize that in many ways our systems are broken for everyone who is not like me. So in my work now, I actually strive to not just recognize that for myself and for my own practices and see how that influences how I approach teaching, but also help to kind of reveal that for other people. And so now all of my work is sort of focused on this idea of looking at those systems, looking at those influences, looking at all of those cultures that impact the student experience, the teacher experience, and starting to reveal some of those hidden biases in those systems. So this is my story. This is what brings me to this work. And it was, as they kind of talk about allyship, they talk about sort of working towards this. It is very uncomfortable to start those conversations. And it's a lot of unraveling of yourself and sort of rethinking about who you are and how you exist in the world when you start to realize how systems have privileged you while simultaneously disadvantaging others. So that is my story. And my doctoral research specifically is focusing on using critical storytelling to first identify mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion in higher education. So start to look at all of those things that exclude and who they exclude and how they exclude. And then simultaneously identify the visible and invisible threads of influence on current and emerging teaching practices. So looking at instructors' identities and practices and trying to determine the things that shape what they do and why they do them. And then taking all of this learning from talking to students and hearing their stories, and from talking to faculty and instructors and hearing their stories, and bringing it together to engage in co-design or writing a better story for more equitable futures for education in a post-digital world. So this work, because students and instructors are both agents in the classroom, they're both people who impact what happens there, the work of designing those better futures needs to happen between both of them. So I'm going to pause for a second, both to take a sip of tea, but also just in case anyone has like questions or if I like threw too much concept and words at you. But does anyone have any questions, thoughts, reflections on what I've shared so far? Does anyone want to jump in and challenge anything I've said so far?
I've got a question, but I'm not so sure whether this is the right time to ask or not, but feel free to delay responding to it because you might be pointing out to this later. So you mentioned your story and how you're not really struggling with inaccessibility or situation that posited you in a different place. You've been fortunate to have kind of distinguished educational system. So did this reshape your experience around what equity is and how to situate inclusion and exclusion? What is the fine line between inclusion, equity, accessibility, privilege, power, system, and all that, all these terms? As I said, feel free to delay, because this is a pretty big spectrum to go into, but here you might do it, as I said.
Yeah, so I can definitely speak to that. I would say, and sort of the conversation that we had at the beginning, as there before we started, I'm still learning. And what I've realized is because I don't have a lot of lived experience of exclusion. My more marginalized identities tend to be invisible or easy to mask. So I guess this is a storytelling workshop, so full disclosure, I'm neurodivergent. I sort of engage socially with others in ways that would be considered divergent as well. So I struggle with social engagement in a lot of ways, but my neurodivergence generally actually made me much more successful in education because I get hyper focused. So I'm really good at that. So I never really saw it as an exclusion. But thinking about how I process the world differently helped me understand that other people process things differently as well. But more generally, I've noticed that the systems really are designed for certain people. And if you're not somebody who the system is not designed for, it takes a lot more work to identify how the system disadvantages people. And it takes a bit of conversation. So that's why I guess storytelling is so important for this, is talking to people who are excluded, hearing their stories of exclusion, understanding how they experience systems, how they experience education, how they experience our policies, our practices, everything that's happening in the classroom, and then determining where those might not be working for those people. So I'm not even sure I answered your question. I think I said lots of different things, but did that answer your question at all, Yasir?
Yeah, you actually did. I asked this question because if I kind of narrate my story, it would be kind of the other way around. It would be the full opposite of what you just said. So that's why I asked you, did you feel what people feel when it comes to inequity? Yeah, that's why I just chose this question in this particular part of the session, because when I acknowledge my story, it's kind of the story that sometimes brings compassion, but I challenge this idea of compassion for some reason, and it brings kind of oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. No, you're not sorry. I worked hard to reach this tapestry of things, because I didn't have this quote, this like distinct education system quote, because I learned in Arabic. I was excluded in the school. I had to commute every day, like for 45 to 60 minutes to school, and all that shaped my identity right now, and shaped who I am in terms of when I now encounter a problem at the university, which is an elite educational system. And I'm fortunate to also have access to that due to having fellowships and stuff. So now this shaped my idea. So I now have a kind of a different sense when it comes to, okay, I have a problem, but I have to work it harder than anyone else to solve this problem, because I was in much more difficult situations than the situation that I'm now in. Yeah. So thank you.
And I think when I'm looking at sort of storytelling as a methodology, I think you've raised one of the really important issues or concerns, is that if we're collecting stories of exclusion, we need to take care to not then just use them as, oh, like you were saying, like not just as a sympathy, a mechanism for that. It's more about sort of identifying experience, acknowledging experience, and honoring experience. But I think it could be really easy to collect all these stories and be like, oh, everyone, like the system's not designed for you. That's so sad, instead of actually taking action. And so that's where the critical part of the storytelling comes in, where it's not it's not just telling stories to make each other feel better or worse about the world. It's telling stories to change things for the better. So I'm again learning, experimental. This is a very messy session, but that's where I'm hoping to go with it.
Yes. Yeah. We have two questions, one from Rose and the other from Jenny. So can you just
Oh, yes. So Jenny asks, it's fascinating. I was wondering how you have integrated people's tendencies to tell the story they think the listener might want to hear. And so Jenny, I'm still sort of in the early stages of this, but I think it really is about telling stories in community. So not just saying like, here's a platform, tell me your story, but kind of starting, and we'll do this in this workshop, starting with micro stories, starting with trust building, starting with actually building a relationship where you've created space, hopefully, for people to tell what stories they want to tell, not stories that you want to hear. And I'm hoping when I do this work to also not be projecting any expectations on what I want to hear from people, and more just making it about like, what have you experienced? So making it about them sharing what they want to share rather than them sort of judging what they think I want to know or hear. So again, untested. But I think that's an important concern, and something that I'll definitely have to keep in mind. And Roz asks, have you experienced different cultures where the mechanisms of storytelling is different from yours? For example, nonverbal modes of storytelling, such as visual modes, physical, whole body movement, dream sharing, 3D crafting, etc., etc., etc. So I've in sort of researching storytelling, I've looked at different mechanisms of storytelling, different types of knowledge representation and knowledge practices, which is really interesting. Within the way that I'm structuring the research, it will be more sort of digital storytelling and focused on sort of multimodal storytelling. So giving people an opportunity to express their stories using digital tools. There might be ways for people to incorporate sort of physical storytelling through video. And I haven't really encountered that yet, but if people are wanting to, like I will endeavor to not really put many constraints on it other than the fact that it is using digital tools and storytelling in a digital space. And that's just more like a constraint on how I'm engaging with people. But I do think you've raised really interesting things. And I think talking about how stories are different in different cultures for different people will be an important thing to consider as well. You guys this is actually really helpful for me. So thank you for your questions on this as I'm shaping this very messy approach to this. Okay, so I'm gonna, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I am going to explain concepts that we'll be using. So one thing that's really core to this is the idea of the post-digital university. I work a lot in online education, e-learning, blended and hybrid and online programming. And what I've noticed is that we like to make this distinction of this is online and this is in person. And there's this kind of separation or delineation between the two, and it's not really meaningful anymore. So the idea of post-digital is the idea that the digital is no longer separate, novel, or other than natural and everyday social life and practices. And in education, this is very much the case, where even if we have a class that's scheduled in a physical classroom at a set time, your students are still engaging in digital practices around that learning. So you may be using the learning management system, or the big topic that we're all talking about, AI. AI is going to filter and kind of come into those physical spaces and how students complete assignments, or how students answer questions, or how students learn. So the idea here is that this separation is no longer helpful, the separation between digital and physical, traditional and online. We really need to start thinking about teaching and learning as all of it is everything. All teaching and learning is both in person and online simultaneously. And those tools and those cultures and those environments and those practices that occur in both places are going to merge together to help shape what the future of education will look like. And so this is just sort of important for when we're thinking about emerging practices, because when we do artificially separate the two, we sort of ignore certain things that are impacting how we teach. and it's detrimental to thinking about how we shape practice. Which then takes us to the second kind of key concept here, which is the idea of emergence and emerging practices. And from science and technology studies, there's this concept called closure. So when the world experiences like great disruption and says, okay, these practices that we've been doing forever no longer work for whatever reason. And our example here is COVID. COVID kind of disrupted all of our teaching practices because we couldn't continue to teach the way that we always did. So this disruption kind of shakes things up and says, okay, so these practices aren't working. Now we need to do something different. And that's where we get emerging practices. So people start to do new things slightly differently, test out things, experiment with things. And for a period of time, this disruption is happening where anything kind of goes, like any practice is okay for a little period of time. And then eventually we reach the state of closure where suddenly, okay, this is the new practice. Everyone's doing this way. So now this practice is going to become normalized. It's going to become solidified. It's going to become the new norm. And once that happens, it makes it really hard to change that practice. So for example, the use of Zoom. At the beginning of COVID, everyone sort of jumped on Zoom, or they might have used like WebEx or other online tools. But at the very beginning, people weren't really sure how to teach in Zoom spaces. It sort of was like, do I use the chat? Do I use video? Do I require all my students to have their video on? How do I share my screen? All of these things. And then over time, people developed what became their sort of new standard practice. And nowadays, the use of Zoom has become so pervasive, so normal, that there's not really a lot of questions around, okay, what does Zoom look like for me, for those people who have been practicing there? It's become stabilized. And it's reached the state of closure where we would no longer really question, like, yes, you should use Zoom. So that's sort of an example of closure. And the really important thing here is that change requires destabilization. So if we want to change our practices, we need to break the practices that exist first. And then the pandemic itself granted us a period of mass destabilization. So it sort of helped shake things up. It helped us identify what practices were working and weren't working. And right now is this like critical time because some people are like, okay, let's go completely backwards. Let's go to everything that we did pre-pandemic. That's the ideal. And some people are like, let's go completely forwards. Let's keep everything online. Let's keep implementing everything we implemented during the pandemic. And somewhere in all of this conversation is where we need to start making decisions on what is going to become the new norm. So I'm going to pause again because those were our two kind of heavy, more theoretical key concepts, questions, comments, reflections on either the idea of post-digital or on the idea of emerging practices and how emergence works. And I invite any comments at all. Again, very fluid.
Hey, I've managed to walk outside the library, so I can ask a question out loud now. I was wondering while you were speaking around post-digital, because we're moving similarly. We've just had sort of an ask that people stop differentiating in support between this is what you do online learning, this is what you do on campus. But in thinking about stories and where like mode and method becomes like, one of those anchoring things, have you noticed people tending to focus on one or the other? Like, even though we're moving into this new post-digital world, are our stories lagging behind a little bit? When we tell them?
I find maybe less related to stories, but more related to practice. When people are telling stories of practice, instructors really, I work, maybe I should have given this context. I work as a curriculum specialist, so I help instructors learn how to teach and apply teaching practices and design courses. And I find instructors identify as either online instructors or traditional instructors, so we do a lot of programming around like inclusive teaching. And our teaching series had to do with it was called like digital teaching. And I had a lot of instructors say, well, that's not applicable to me because I teach in a traditional way. I just teach in a classroom. So I don't need to learn like inclusive teaching. I don't need to learn UDL. So it's less about the storytelling mechanism and more about how instructors identify themselves. And there is a very clear delineation between traditional instructors or online instructors and them seeing where their practices sit in those two spaces. I see your thumbs up, Dani, so I'm guessing that answered your question. Any other questions or comments or reflections on maybe what this might mean in your own context? Okay, so we really are here to talk about stories, and I haven't done a lot of talking about stories. So let's move on to stories. And I promise you, most of the session is actually going to be storytelling and talking about stories. I'll pause quickly because Roz has a question. Your research is focused on your current context, Canada higher ed. Have you had exposure to higher ed contexts in different countries? Do you know if closure has occurred in all countries after COVID, or if some countries are still in the mass destabilization phase? I haven't really looked at other, I haven't really looked explicitly at other countries or other contexts. And I haven't really looked across all of Canada. So my experience in Canada is sort of based on my position within 3 institutions. So I am a curriculum specialist, full-time staff at one institution in Southwest Ontario. I am a PhD student at a second institution in Ontario, and I am a sessional instructor at an institution in British Columbia. So my experience of sort of these conversations and how they're occurring and how practices are being discussed is within sort of those 3 contexts right now. My research, I'm hoping, will be broadly inviting people across Canada to tell their stories, but I'm still working out the research ethics board logistics of that. But I think you do raise a really important question, especially when we talk about post-digital Roz, is those kind of artificial boundaries that we even place between educational institutions, between countries, may not be helpful in telling these stories, because people do kind of exist and conversations do exist in multiple places. Even in this audience, I think we have people from at least 4 different countries, and we only have 5 participants. So our conversations and our stories are going to transcend those borders already. Okay, so getting back to stories. So here is a quote from Ben Okri, who writes, "We live by stories. We also live in them. One way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early on, knowingly or unknowingly. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives." And so the way that I interpret this and why this is sort of key to how I'm thinking about stories is stories aren't just the things that we tell to other people about ourselves. Stories are also the things that shape how we see ourselves and how we practice. So in higher education, when we were talking about sort of like closure and normal practices and all of the things that we do and why we do them, a lot of that is built on stories. So one of my favorite things to think about when we talk about sort of like closure, or those practices that are so reified they can't be changed, is grades. And we grade because we've always graded, and everyone's always told us to use grades. And grades are this thing that we sort of convinced ourselves, and the stories of practice have sort of convinced us that grades are not really mutable. We can't really change grading practices because so many things are built upon them, which is really, really interesting, because now we start to see the ungrading movement. We start to see people pushing back against grading practices. And it's a really challenging conversation because again, of that closure, because grading systems are so embedded at multiple layers of the institution, and student expectations of how we practice, and departmental expectations of what we report back, and institutional expectations of how we measure our students and compare to other institutions. So it's again, this story that we've told ourselves, we've convinced ourselves, our institutions have convinced us is this is the way the world is. But I would posit that it's not really that way. It's just because we've convinced ourselves through these institutional stories that that has to be the way things are. So just starting to think about the impact of stories and how they can act in both good and sort of create kind of stagnation because of how stories are kind of powerful indicators of how institutions work. So storytelling. we are actually now going to write stories. So this is where we're kind of moving into the actual doing of stories. And we're going to start with just micro storytelling, an opportunity for each of you to think about your own stories, the stories you tell yourself, and particularly thinking about teaching identity stories here. So the ask I have is to take 3 to 4 minutes and write a 5-word teaching philosophy. So I've done this activity a lot, and people really get caught up in the 5 words and like, what can I put into it? And it actually ties back to the question that was asked. I can't remember who asked it, but Jenny asked about the story you think the listener might want to hear. I think when you're kind of writing this 5-word teaching philosophy, a lot of people are thinking about, okay, how do I want other people to see me? And you get caught up in that. So this is an opportunity for you to think about, like, who are you really? Like, how do you approach your teaching really, rather than thinking about how do you want other people to see your teaching? So my micro story, my 5-word teaching philosophy, is helping students question the unquestionable. This ties into that whole idea of unwriting those stories, questioning those stories of practice, questioning those stories of systems, questioning those stories of society that we've convinced ourselves are just fact, are just truth, and giving them a place to say, okay, well, maybe this is not really the way the world needs to be. So that is my micro story. We're going to pause for 4 minutes, and I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to write your own 5-word teaching philosophy. And if you're joining me within the slides, if you go to slide 12 or 13, you'll see that there are little speech bubbles, and you can choose a speech bubble and start writing your story. If you'd prefer to do it on paper or kind of in a more private venue, you're welcome to do it not within the slides as well. But we will pause. If you're still thinking. So if you're still thinking of your teaching philosophy, if you're still shaping your story, you can continue on. But I see there are 2 here. I'm going to invite you to share your teaching philosophy if you'd like to. And the questions are not just what is your teaching philosophy, but what is the process of having written that teaching philosophy? Did you learn anything? Did you find it really easy or really hard to find the words to kind of write concisely about how you teach? What were you thinking about? Who were you writing it for? So just some questions about not just what is your teaching philosophy and explain it, but also what did the action of writing it do for you and how did it make you feel? So would anyone like to share?
I'd go for like challenging inequity to reach voices.
I like it, Azir. Do you wanna expand on it, explain it at all, or do you?
Most of the arguments that we kind of have nowadays around, at least within my scope of knowledge, is that we tend to forget that there are voices that are not heard, that are not represented the way we want them to be. And whether they be disabled voices, the marginalized voices, and whether they be voices that are suppressed because of power and systematic power and privilege. So we tend to forget all these, and we tend to keep suppressing them and forgetting them, demeaning their existence. And so that would be my own practice, that okay, challenging inequity to reach voices. And if I achieve that, I achieve the full, I'm not saying inclusive, but the full equitable approach.
I think that's like a really powerful teaching philosophy. In crafting it, did you have any sort of like interesting aha moments, or was it challenging for you to kind of find the words to make it only 5 words, or was there anything sort of in the writing of it that was interesting to you?
I'll tell you something. Actually, when in the whole 4 minutes, I was actually stuck. But when you started talking and started, jotting down those kind of we're coming back, it just popped over my mind in just one single second. So I think that that's enacted because that's my passion. It comes with that, you know, feeling that okay, I need to compound these words together and or to weave them together into something funny or something beneficial or useful. No, just see where your passion goes and start doing them. Start following it.
Yeah, that's actually really, really interesting that it was like that moment, because when I have like activities like this, I find I often get stuck as well. So I'm glad that you kind of it came to you at the end. And Roz has asked if you wouldn't mind typing it. And she writes, just because she's a little challenged with audio input and would prefer visual input. So if you don't mind typing it, Yazir, or I can, oh, perfect, thank you. Would anyone else like to share?
I can, although now I've listened to the essays, obviously. You do that thing where you're like, oh no, that was amazing. Mine was, sorry, I've got a child asking me a question now. Mine was, what can we accomplish together? And I think for this process, I was helped along the way because I've had to do quite a few applications for various grants or awards recently, and they always ask, what's your teaching philosophy? And most of my work is rooted around sort of enabling equitable collaboration. So not just who's in the room, but widening what the room is and all this kind of thing. So, and it's driven by this idea that there's just such a deep loss when any person can't contribute. So it was interesting to me to have to kind of phrase it in only 5 words, where normally I'm definitely a several hundred word person for a philosophy kind of writer. And I think it made me just distill it down to like, well, what's the question I always ask myself? And it's something about doing things together. So it was really interesting. Yeah, and I appreciate how you also use this to answer the question I had around stories, because I can see how this would be really helpful in sort of blasting past all of the sort of stuff that wraps around your philosophy, you know, that might just be more of a demonstration of how you do it as opposed to the actual philosophy itself. So, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I think yours, as you described it, it really conveys what you were saying is sort of core to your practice, that idea of making sure everyone is able to participate. So the together is a really powerful word. And the 5 words also forces you to get rid of all of the shiny words, all of the things that really are just there to be like, look, I'm using these like big buzzwords, and really focus on the core of it. So 5 is sort of like an arbitrary number, but it is meant to be like concise, like what's actually important.
What actually drew my attention in Jenny's question is, and that's what I think I haven't taught myself. I have never been to a classroom as a teacher or a faculty member, but I think that sometimes faculty tend to forget what their purpose in the class is, and when they see the question, what can we accomplish? Okay, so it's just this silent mode that people, what can we accomplish with this classroom? What can I accomplish with my grading? What can I accomplish with my syllabus and learning outcomes? And this, I think, if it pops over people, faculty, like professors' minds every day whenever they enter a classroom, if it's being stuck on a classroom wall, it will be a kind of a good reminder of, okay, what can we accomplish with that and not stress our students, right? So that's what interested me in this question, to be honest.
I like your suggestion, your idea of putting it on the classroom wall. So this teaching philosophy being something that you actually share with your students, because I think it also helps with that trust and transparency. You're saying like, this is what I am bringing, or this is how I am viewing my job as your teacher, or as the instructor in this space. So I really like that idea too. Would anyone else like to share?
I can go. So I actually already had this 5-word statement some time ago, And it was actually a title of a presentation previously that I did for Maha's University. So I say fun learning, always, with the always spelled two ways. Always as in AL, single L, every possible way to do something, and always as in ALL, that means all the time. And fun is an acronym which stands for function, user, and needs. So on the surface, it's sort of fun, just something lighthearted, but in actuality, there's a lot of deep thought that goes into it. So whenever I do any design work for input to my students or to my learners, because some of them are professors, actually, I'm an instructional designer. I work with faculty, and now I work with corporate people. But so function is usually the most important thing, especially for administrators, all the stakeholders that are policymakers, they think of function. ROI, return on investment. You're welcome to enlarge that. It was actually a reduced slide. I just copied it from another presentation. And then user is to actually look at the different stakeholders, so the actual users and the needs of those stakeholders. So when I say needs, even before you begin to think about the content or the purpose, there's always prerequisite needs. So even before you begin teaching, you have to understand what the prerequisite needs are in order for the learner to even begin to comprehend what you're trying to do. So for me, that's my philosophy, is to look at all the stories behind the scenes before they can even begin to start thinking of learning. And if you do all of that, then yeah, learning does end up being fun. But if you don't do that, not so fun.
I really like the questions that are laid out in this graphic, Ross, because I think they're actually really important for those conversations. Like I said, I have a lot of conversations with instructors and people building courses as well. So what is the function of this tool? How has this tool impacted learning throughout history? I think that's really, really interesting and important question. It goes back to that idea of those stories we tell ourselves. So we use the learning management system because we're told this is the best thing to do, but nobody really ever critically reflects on like, okay, what is this actually doing for your teaching? So I really like those questions. I'm just going to read the other ones aloud too. What are the pre-existing or innate characteristics, behaviors, habits, likes, and dislikes of the learners? And what needs to be ensured beforehand? What must be present or available before the learning process can even begin? So it's very impactful. It was also a little bit clever to me that you put in an acronym. So technically you have 7 words.
Well, Maha does call me like, oh, this is the acronym person. I tend to make acronyms anyway, but you're welcome to use that if you'd like it. It is published, so you're welcome to quote it if you'd like.
That's awesome. I will go look it up because it looks actually like really a useful tool. Thank you for sharing. Any comments for Roz, or does anyone else want to share their philosophy? And again, if you would prefer not to, if this is you could choose how you wish to engage in this space, so there's no pressure. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next sort of key concept here, which is the idea of networks. So core to what we're really looking at here when we're looking at emerging practices or new practices is I may come to a classroom space with my teaching philosophy where I want to help learners question the unquestionable. And in a perfect world, I would not be impeded in that mission. I would not be impeded in enacting my teaching philosophy and being who I want to be in the classroom. But that's not really the reality. As we probably all know, all of our practices are situated inside of these networks that influence how we act, what we can do, what we should do, and sort of the expectations. So this is really kind of key to what we're talking about here is even though we have these ideals of what we want to do, all of these other things are influencing us. And in the what I'm drawing on when I'm talking about networks comes from a couple of different places. So first, Donna Haraway's idea of cat's cradle. where she talks about social practice, and she says that worlds get made and unmade through a complex entanglement of threads and knots, human and non-human actors. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Cat's Cradle, it is a game that's played with a piece of string, where you kind of use your hands to manipulate the string to create different kind of interesting patterns of entanglement. So the string kind of changes shape. It's usually played with two people. But she uses this metaphor to say, like, this is kind of how the world is. So it might seem like it's not really that complex, but every piece of string is kind of woven around each other, is knotted in different ways. And all of these things together create the reality. And I really like drawing on her metaphor because it's just such an interesting way of thinking about the world. Dahl, similarly within curriculum studies, he wrote a piece and did a lot of work on the postmodern curriculum. And in his understanding of curriculum, he talks about it as a complex system with multiple interacting forces. So he draws actually a lot on metaphors using systems from physics and from the sciences. And what he really says is that sometimes when we talk about curriculum, we try and sanitize it, we try and clean it up. So we ignore so many things that are happening in the curriculum. And we get rid of all the mess when we talk about it. And then what we're actually talking about isn't the reality. And that's problematic because we're ignoring all of those things that exert influence on the curriculum. So he says we need to embrace the mess. We need to talk about all of those pieces, all of those things that change what happens in the classroom, because otherwise we're not really talking about the reality. So he has a really interesting kind of take on it as well. And then finally, Bruno Latour talks about actor networks in actor network theory, or ANT, which is another great acronym. There you go, Roz. But ANT, or actor network theory, talks about, again, that social practices result from a network of entangled agencies. So a lot of what he did was sort of study science labs. And he, again, comes from science and technology studies. But he also looks at, I think he did a whole thing about law and how law works, but he looks at how a practice, again, is embedded in all of these different people, all of these different artifacts, so policies and documents and papers, all of these different institutions and physical spaces, and all of that exerts force on how social practice actually occurs. So these are sort of three theoretical looks at how networks are a really important way to understand emerging practices, because we don't work in silos, and all of these things will change what we can do and whether or not we can actually live our teaching philosophies. So again, connecting it all back to stories. This is a really amazing book called Becoming: Transformative Storytelling for Education's Future. And it really talks about different ways of using stories to kind of critically examine and change and untangle what happens in the classroom and sort of education broadly. And the quote here reads, "Storytelling helps people create the conditions for critical examination of our belief systems and the broader social, cultural, political, and structural forces that shape them." So very much tied into networks and that idea of all of those influences, all of those tangled strings. But really saying the story can help us figure out what's going on here. It can help us look at the whole picture. So I'm going to pause quickly and just see if anyone has any. Oh, I see Jenny says that she's looking at Belonging, Becoming, Mattering. If anyone wants to sort of jump in here, share something, question something, reflect on something, just going to open it up.
I'm just curious, are you sort of at what stage are you at your research right now? Sounds like a very interesting pursuit that you're doing.
That's a very interesting question. I am currently negotiating with my thesis supervisor on how to shape the research. The issue that I'm encountering is that she's an education psychologist, so it's very like quantitative, empirical type research, which is, as you can see, very much not what I am trying to do here. So we're trying to negotiate how this can work. And then I'm seeking sort of advice on people who do more critical type research to shape it. So I've done like this workshop and kind of variations of this, just testing out some of the storytelling techniques. And then I'm working on kind of finalizing my research proposal, hopefully going through REB. So very early stages.
So you're more into the qualitative aspects of things, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the stories and kind of untangling and kind of looking at the stories. So yeah, we will see how it all unfolds.
I look forward to you presenting more on it, maybe in next year's MyFest.
Thank you. I'm hoping I have made some significant progress by then, so we will see. Okay, so we are going to move on to our next storytelling activity. And this is network storytelling. So again, thinking about the stories that we live by, the networked stories or the storied networks in which we practice. The idea here is that now that you have your teaching philosophy, or if you wanted to choose something else, choose a specific teaching practice, you could do that as well. But we're going to map out all of the things that influence your ability to enact this philosophy or your ability to practice in a certain way. And this is why we spent a bit of time at the beginning sort of going through how to use Google Slides, because I encourage you not just to use text, but use colors, shapes, images, and other media to map out your story. So on your slide, and there are lots of blank slides, slides 18 through 23, you can choose whichever one you want. I want you to start thinking about what influences your practice or your ability to enact that philosophy, and consider beliefs, not just your own, but of the other people who have influence in that space, assumptions, policies, people, cultures, resources, spaces, places, tools, knowledge practices, disciplinary influence. So our signature pedagogies are the way we're told to teach within our discipline. Your own educational experiences or backgrounds. So as I talked about at the very beginning, my practice is a bit separate from my own educational experiences because I never experienced major barriers in education. So it takes me more time to understand where those barriers may exist. So there's an example of how your own educational experiences may influence practice. Your inherited pedagogies. So a lot of us teach in a certain way because we were taught in that way. So thinking about that. The traditions or those stories that we live by, if we go back to what Okri was saying, or anything else that might influence your practice. So I'm going to just quickly show like a mini demo of what I'm asking here. So I'm going to take slide 18. And instead of looking at my teaching philosophy, I'm just going to map a specific practice just so you can kind of understand what I mean when I'm talking about influences. And my practice is group work. So core to my approach to teaching is connectivism, is the idea that students need to work together, engage in social learning. And so I try in my courses to always have some sort of group work component, which has varying degrees of success. And things that influence this, and I apologize, I've not done this online, so this is going to be a bit different. I usually have like a whiteboard or a blackboard. But things that impede group work, first of all, like very, very pragmatic, is the add drop period. So if I set up groups at the beginning of a course, they might change. So students really find it hard to form a group and form group connections because students might drop out for the first 2 to 3 weeks of the course, or new students might come in. So a really big impediment to group work is simply the add drop period. And that's like a very practical consideration of how groups can and can't work. Another big impediment are student expectations. So I teach asynchronous, fully online courses, and a lot of students come to those courses because they think, oh, well, I can just do this independently on my own. Like it's just a very individualized learning experience. So some students may come to these courses and push back against group work because they weren't expecting to have to collaborate, to have to learn in community. So that's another big impediment to group work. Another big impediment might be group work skills are lacking. So, not group work skills or skills, group work skills are lacking. So here it might be that a lot of times students are just expected to know how to perform in a group, how groups work, how to communicate in a group, and these skills are not really innate skills. So there needs to be an explicit teaching of it. So that's another expectation or another kind of limitation on group work. And then we can kind of continue on and on and on. But this is, again, not just sort of that big theory stuff, but this is very much like those practical things that impact how and if I'm able to teach in this way that aligns with my teaching philosophy, which is having students sort of work together. So this is an example of what I'm asking you guys to do. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. So there is a bit of time. You can choose your slide. I think, yeah, Zir might turn off the recording because he did last time. But it's just kind of a time to reflect on either, again, your teaching philosophy, or if you'd rather choose a more concrete, specific teaching practice, you could do either. Roz, right now, what I'm asking you, so Roz asks, do you want us to also include solutions and not just impediments? So the solutions is going to be the next phase of storytelling, where we're going to reshape those networks. So right now, I just want you to sort of map anything that influences it. They don't all have to be impediments though. So I guess for group work, I could have put something like outgoing students love group work or something. So they can also be positive factors that influence that practice. I guess I just put a lot of the negatives. And then how I found a good solution for that, I can type in the chat how I've tried to navigate that, but I will pause now and give you guys the 10 minutes to work on your own practice. If you guys, sorry, if you guys do like collectively want more time, you can just let me know in the chat. Otherwise, does anyone want to share what you had sort of mapped out? And not just what you've mapped out, but also thinking about as other people share, thinking about, did you guys have similar things that were influencing your practice? Knots and nodes, for using the cat's cradle metaphor. Did you have similar connections? Is there anything, as people are sharing, think about, is there anything that you see on somebody else's map that suddenly you're like, oh, that sparked an idea for me. I forgot that on my own map. Are there similar things that are constraining or supporting, not just negative, but similar things that are constraining or supporting your practice? Are there any contradictions? So just some questions for you to think about as people share. But would anyone like to share their networked story? If nobody wants to share, that's fine too. I'm not going to force anyone to share. I did, in response to Danielle's suggestion, I did put comments on my own story about sort of how I've tried to overcome some of these. But like I said, our next story telling activity is going to be sort of reimagining these networks or imagining our practice. So we'll do some.
Danielle has her hand up actually.
Oh,
so.
thank you. I did not see that. Danielle, please go ahead. I apologize for ignoring you. It was not intentional.
No worries. I put it up just as you started speaking. My approach when it comes to something this complex is usually to boil things down to a few items. And the reason I do that is because of my experience in special education, where, you know, like, I don't know how the practice works where all of you are, but for us, what it was in primary school, what you would do is you would meet with the student involved, their parents, the principal, and people who might be supporting the students' learning, such as a speech therapist or something. And so you're all there together and you're all discussing what the problems are and what solutions are. But one person explained to me that, you know, you can have 1,000 solutions, and there are very specific techniques you need to apply to certain issues. But she said, if you can choose 3 primary things and resolve those things, you will likely resolve 80 to 100% of the rest of the problems. So that's my approach when anything is complex. I try to bring out some of the most important things and just address them. And if by the end of the course or the end of whatever cycle I'm in, I realize that, oh, I needed to take another approach, then I can refine it. But if I try to look at 1,000 items, I will never be able to evaluate my method and improve it. So while systems are complex, I try to look for the simplicity within them that I can control, that I can work on. And so that's why on my slide, and I'm not going to read through every single point, I've chosen just a few points. And these are things, if I were teaching a course, these are things that I would address. So what I've done is at the farthest extremity, like at the most outside of the slide, are things that I think aim towards the middle. Like I need to learn from the top. I need to learn what generally interests students in a given course. By filling that need, I get to my aim at the center of the slide, which is ideal learning is effective and enjoyable. But the barrier that impedes that ability to find out about what interests students, that the barrier is the time needed to build enough trust for them to share. You can't really expect students to share important things from the start. And I think there's a lot of time needed to build that trust so that they'll do it. And that time that's required is a major issue in all courses, I find, because it's all about get through the material, get the students tuition. We don't want the money. We want as many students as we can. And it sometimes feels like we're in a machine. And so it feels like we need to circumvent the methods or the constraints that are imposed on us. And so this is one way of thinking about how to navigate the constraints.
And Roz has her hand up as well.
1 second, Ross. I want to say to Danielle, thank you so much for sharing. I think that your point that you sort of should choose a couple of things to focus on does make the work less overwhelming. I think you made one really important point where you were like, you really need to focus on the things that you can control. And when we look at these networks, there's so many things within them that will be outside of our control, or we don't have influence, or we don't have power. So I think that was like a really, really important point, and I appreciate you sharing that. And your map also looks very like clean and tidy because you focus on just those 3 things. So it does make it also seem less overwhelming. So I appreciate you sharing. And Roz, I don't know if you wanted to respond to Danielle or if you wanted to share your own map.
I was going to share my own, but yeah, I can respond to Danielle's as well. I thought that was a really good presentation. If you want, I can talk about mine as well.
Yeah,
so most of the time I work with either instructors and now I work with corporate clients. And so most of the work that I do is immersion learning. So it's not classroom based. It's in situation, in context, and when it's not live in actual real-time needs, it's simulation based, because the kind of work that I do is entirely non-classroom, on the spot, solving problems in live situations. Because, you know, like yourself, you're an instructor, and most of the things that I've done in the past, for example, like when the university shifted to a new LMS and there was actually no time to train any of the instructors to shift to a new LMS, And so you're actually having to teach people while they themselves are teaching students. So that's the kind of context that I work with. Very much so now, even in the corporate world, it's even worse. So, firefighting, they call on me only when, there's a corporate takeover, things are changing, and it needs to be done yesterday, that kind of stuff. So I do immersion learning. And while functionality, I put there, it's a great ROI, return on investment, for all the stakeholders involved, because it's real life. So not only do I teach and it's actually being implemented and actually being used, so that's a great positive, but there's a lot of negative stuff too. The impediments are that it's literally different for each individual. So how do you do instruction? How do you do teaching where the individuality is there's no scaling? Every learner is so different and every context is different. So that's a big impediment. And because it's so individual, the background needs of each learner, each person comes with their own idiosyncrasies, their own skill sets or lack of skill sets. So that's also a real that's a real challenge. And so the way that I handle all of that is, like you said, what influenced this philosophy is I had the same background myself. So whether it was positive experiences or negative experiences, limitations, my own background limitations where I was not able to have the needs in place before I was thrown into the deep end of the pool. So that kind of experience really shaped the way that I do things now. So that's why I said, you're learning all the time, always, and in all different ways, even when it's nothing to do with the actual learning content. Sometimes you just have to be able to balance your personal life so that you are able to give more time into your work life to handle a situation that's really bad. And if you're able to balance all of that in real time, then you can have fun. So.
Thank you for sharing, Ross. I thought, first of all, the thing that really struck me was you talking about the learning management system transition. My institution is about to undergo that. So you've given me, I wouldn't say hope, I'd say you've given me fear for what the next year is going to look like. But I think we are taking a bit of a systematic approach. But your context of sort of, you said you were an instructional designer.
Yes, that's right.
I've sort of worked in that context as well. It's interesting because you teach, you're teaching instructors, but you're also teaching them how to teach. So it has that that multi-layered thing. That's a really interesting context for teaching too. And I appreciate the comment on immersion learning, that it's very much like learning on the go, learning on the fly. So does anyone else have comments for Roz? See, Jenny's are in the chat. I don't know if you want to speak.
Yes.
To here, Jenny.
Yeah, sure. I was just saying, Roz made me think about like how, and Danielle actually went to challenge you, how this sort of activity, if you start thinking about, oh, so these are sort of the interruptions or things that make things difficult, like where are they almost vulnerable to disruption, or in a negative way, like where has cost of living crisis and COVID and all the, influence these barriers or enhance them in some way. But also, if you did want to start,
I can share one of the biggest positive things is because the faculty went through that horrible transition LMS a couple of years before COVID. So when COVID finally came and I wasn't there anymore, the number of emails and messages is like, oh my God, now we really appreciate what we went through with that crazy transition before, because they were ready for COVID because of that. So sometimes the positive doesn't happen then. Sometimes the positive happens 2 years after. And so I know for me, that was, a positive thing in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you a sense of where the status quo is a little bit vulnerable, isn't it? Like, it seems unchanging, our LMS, it seems impossible to learn new things. But each time you have the staff or everyone collectively do that kind of thing, you start learning where to position yourself for change. I thinking about storytelling and things, the way to position the stories to make people feel more confident about change. So that was a really interesting thing. So thanks, Ros.
I'm just actually jotting that down, what you just said, Jenny, the where to position yourself for change, and how this sort of approach to storytelling and mapping your network allows you to identify places of vulnerability. Because I think that's actually really, really.
I rather famously forget what I've said the second I've said it. So it's imperative that you write it down if you want to remember it yourself. Because even if I was there, if you're like, what did you say about change? And I'd be like,
Dani, you should type it in the chat box so that we can all benefit from it.
I'll try. Yes, I'll try. That's the problem.
Well, I'll write what I just jotted down on my post-it. Learn where to position yourself for change. And then I think your comments, I think we're able to save the chat, but I think your comments above are also really helpful. So where you can disrupt the status quo and identifying, oh, that wasn't there. Identifying places of vulnerability in the system or network. Okay, so you've given us all lots of things to think about, Jenny. Thank you. Okay, so then this brings us into our last piece of the puzzle, which is starting to look forward. And thinking about, okay, if we're talking about emerging practices, we're talking about the future. We're talking about what will the future look like? Like, what will teaching and learning and our learning environments and our teaching practices look like in the future? And part of the way that I've sort of been thinking about this and conceptualizing this is moving from past presence to present futures. So past presence is this concept that comes from work done by King, who was a researcher who worked with Donna Haraway. And she does work in networked reenactments. So like in how we reenact history and how we form history today. And her concept of past presence states that the past and the present are in a constant cycle of convergence and co-invention. So we sometimes think of history as this is what happened in the past, but it's not really what history is. History is more what is important about the past to us today. So history is constantly being reformed, rewritten based on the politics and the ideas and the values and the current context of today. And so when she talks about networked reenactments, she's saying there's this constant cycle of bringing history forward and reinventing history in a way that's meaningful and valuable for people in the present. And this is her idea of past presence. So building on that, I am presenting the idea of present futures. So again, thinking about the fact that the future is not just what is going to happen tomorrow, but the future is emergent and they're entangled in the possibilities of the present. So when we talk about the future, when we're building the future, when we're dealing with emerging practices of the future, it's very much rooted in what's happening today, what's important today, what we care about today, and that will shape our future. And that is this idea, again, of the present future. So what is possible tomorrow is about what's happening today. And so when we talk about stories and we talk about speculative storytelling now, so imagining those futures, the quote I have here is from Watts, and he writes, telling stories of the future is always a social, material, and political practice. It always has effects. It is always non-innocent. So speculative storytelling, shaping the future, imagining what the future will be, is a political act. It can be a radical act, and it very much is shaped by your motivations, by your values, by your beliefs, by what you think the future should be, both when we engage in sort of hopeful speculative storytelling, so imagining what could the best possible future be, but also when we write stories of the future that are more built in sort of the dystopian visions of, oh no, what horrible thing could the future look like? Which is, I always like the Black Mirror reference. If anyone is familiar with the TV show Black Mirror, it's all about sort of the dystopian future. And they're really impactful because they're plausible stories about how technology could shape the future for, I'd argue most episodes, not all episodes, but for the worst. but there is a or politics associated with it, because it's sending a message about what we need to do now to make sure either we are achieving those hopeful futures, those ideals, or what we need to stop doing now, or what we need to do now to prevent those sort of more morbid, dark possible futures. So this again ties the idea of storytelling to writing the future. So I will pause, see if anyone has any comments, reflections, if this has sparked any ideas for anyone. And I'll just make a quick comment about my picture here. It's I think, a slightly disturbing robot child sitting at a desk with other robot child behind them, or children behind them. And I think I used Midjourney to generate it. But thoughts on present, futures, or storytelling, speculative storytelling?
So you generated that picture, you didn't like find it?
No, I used Midjourney, which is a text to image AI generator tool. So I think I put in a prompt that was like robot classroom or something. I did it a while ago. Maybe I put it in my alt text. We're going to see if I am actually doing like proper practices here. Oh, an AI generated image of a classroom full of robots. I think that's the prompt that I used, was the classroom full of robots. I use Midjourney a lot to generate images for things. It's very interesting what it comes up with.
I was more interested in the fact that you chose to generate your own image versus searching for an image. That in itself is a change in work culture. Just a mere year or two ago, I think that would not have been the common practice. Am I right?
Oh, I agree. Yeah. And I think AI is like a huge discussion point for when we talk about emerging practices, as institutions start forming policies around how do we police AI use, how do we incorporate AI use, how do we teach AI literacy. It actually would probably be a really interesting, just in and of itself, object of study for how we look at kind of emergence, because we can't avoid AI use in education as much as some instructors would like to. And then just to explain why I use it, I make all of my slides like openly licensed, so that just takes away the copyright complication of stealing something from other places online.
So I asked this question because it's in line with what you're saying, is that, you know, these emerging stories from the present future and the previous exercise that you had us do, what are the things that influence us and what are the things that inform our practices? You know, I'm just highlighting just that little bit. You know, I caught on that little sentence you said, you created this image. So just doing self-reflection is a huge portion in you know, understanding how these changes in storytelling are, at least in the practice that I do, which is, you know, looking at how instructors move forward in the learning journey. So self-reflection and recognizing where these changes occur. Sometimes you don't realize it till someone asks you a question and you go, oh yeah, that's another change. So that's why I asked you that question, because that is a change in your practice.
Oh, definitely. And I think now I'm going to go map out why I do it and how I've been using it, because for work, we've been generating content to teach people about generative AI. So I think I actually could do a lot of self-reflection, Roz. So thank you for highlighting that. Metacognitive self-coaching, is that a term, or did you just?
Well, that's what I call it, because I do metacognitive coaching. So I don't teach instructors, I do coaching. And so I don't do normal coaching. This is metacognitive. So we, you know, to invite you to go up on the balcony to see yourself, to be able to identify what are the changes in your own practices, because that informs what you do with your students.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I like the term as well. Metacognitive self-coaching. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And as a methodology, my hope is that people will sort of have that self-reflection. I'm not sure if it would be considered autoethnography, but like that sort of looking at their own practices and what's shaping them. So it's I appreciate the term and sort of thinking about it that way. Okay, so moving on just to our very last storytelling exercise, and this was going to be in breakout rooms, but since we're such a small group, I don't think that's necessary. But the very last thing I wanted people to do was to, now thinking about your network, thinking about those things that influence your practice, thinking about what supports you. So what allows you to practice the way you want to, and thinking about what constrains you, what prevents you from maybe fully enacting your teaching philosophy or the practice that you focused on. We're going to write an educational future that either embodies hope and would allow you to fully enact your teaching philosophy. So what needs to change in your network for you to do that? Or if you wanted to go the other way, that embodies critical skepticism and shows the dark possibilities based on the influences identified in your web. So if those things that constrain you gained more power, gained more influence, what could the future look like? And you can choose depending on sort of your vibe for the day, if you want to go the hopeful way or the skeptical way. And this is very open-ended. I'm just going to invite you to sort of shape your story however you'd like. And there are slides 28, 29, 30, and 31 where you can start to put pieces together. But what I want you to think about as you're doing is what agents, knots, and nodes. So which of those influences, those circles, or those pieces of your network need to change in order to achieve or avoid this future? So where does change need to happen? Which goes back, I think Jenny has left us, but it goes back to what she was saying, like, where is the network vulnerable? Where can things change? Which agents, knots, and nodes persist? So what things can stay the same, but still allow you to have that future? Is your future plausible? Who is impacted positively by this future, and who is impacted negatively by this future? So there's a lot of questions here, a lot of things to kind of think about, but it really is just a kind of free canvas exercise in speculating about the future. And I'm going to ask that we spend about 5 minutes doing this, so you get less time to shape your future than you did to build your network, just because I'm cognizant that we're 15 minutes out from the end. I think this group is too small for breakout rooms. I think because Jenny has now left, so we only have a few participants. So I was going to just ask that we work as sort of one small group. Thank you. Would anyone like to share their stories of the future?
I'll share mine, but I'll keep it very brief. The main thing I would like to see is that the courses that are taught online at my institution about trades, it would really be nice if they involved discussions about values. For example, respectful ways for tradespeople and clients to interact, so that the tradesperson feels like they're being heard and understood by the client, and also that the client doesn't feel like they're being manipulated or deceived in any way. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of the courses are just, it's the basic technical knowledge that is taught, and there's nothing about interaction. Like a doctor might learn about bedside manner. Well, I think all professions would benefit from some kind of coaching about communication. And so what I think would be required to achieve this change in the courses, well, definitely it means that more time needs to be devoted to the classroom where this stuff needs to be taught. That means that, teachers would have to be paid more because they're teaching more. And this is why for the institution where money is concerned, they might be hesitant. So it would require approval for all of these kinds of changes. And then once in the classroom, it would require the teacher and the students to think in very different ways, because it's not purely just objective facts and methods that they're learning about, but it's also questioning themselves, which requires vulnerability, openness, and honesty about who you are as a person and how you treat other people.
So would it also change the people who are qualified to teach those courses, Danielle, or do you think the existing instructors would have the skills and knowledge to teach that?
I think that there would be value in having educational developers work with the teachers to do this work effectively. I think some instructors have the skills in them, but consistently my experience has been is that instructors need support in how to communicate things well. Once they get it, then they get it. But they'll have ideas in their mind, but they don't know how to make them explicit. So what they might express is half ideas. Or some instructors might feel like they're forced to do this kind of thing. And so they'll do the bare minimum to say that the task has been done, but they don't embody the values inside. So that again is something where, and I think an educational developer would be helpful. Now, the thing is that for that help to be given to the instructor, that means that that instructor needs to be given time to receive that professional development. And that's also an issue, because the teachers don't have a lot of time given to them for professional development. They're most of their time is just for developing the courses, and that's it. So there are a lot of need to be given to account for the human factor of teaching and not just content delivery.
And I wonder, I'm just thinking of, I worked in health sciences before, and I would say that some instructors might be more resistant to trying to teach what they might be considered outside of their scope of knowledge. Do you think that resistance would be a problem here as well, where the instructors would be like, no, I don't want to teach that?
Oh, absolutely. Even if 5 or 10 years down the road, the instructors see that, oh yeah, this is definitely beneficial. I could definitely see instructors pushing back on this kind of change. Absolutely.
Interesting. I think you've raised like other nodes that could kind of influence the change and some really interesting considerations. So thank you for sharing. And Roz has written in the chat, good point, Danielle, values equal critical in all subjects, which I think is very true, but I think is a challenge to implement in a lot of, I don't know if we say hard sciences anymore, but a lot of the more empirical or the more positivist disciplines, where people are like, no, there is no need for sort of values or talking about bias or talking about feelings in this subject. And then faculty development is a critical requisite for any change. And I agree, Roz. Any other feedback for Danielle or comments?
No, I would just want to chip in and share that, one part that I'm considering when it comes to the future is students choosing the pathway for learning. So as we've been mentioning earlier about the idea of add and drop that Rose, or I think Danielle brought to the conversation, we also have to understand that these in liberal arts institution have this idea of core curriculum courses that are kind of imposed on students, and sometimes although they have the lists of courses to choose from, they kind of feel I don't want to do science, I don't want to do economics, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that, and this kind of gets students to feel like they are kind of obligated to conform to a specific learning environment that they are not part of. And therefore, what do we do in terms of allowing students to choose the fast way for learning? Can we also make AI an AI app? And that's like I've done this for a competition at my institution, that I wrote that AI will be able to matchmake. I hope that I'm using the right verb, to matchmake the students together in order to allow them to kind of working in like-minded groups and work with like-minded individuals. Yeah.
I find that fascinating. I have been creating materials on AI, and like the biases that exist in it gives me a bit of pause for what you're talking about as an application for it easier.
Yeah,
I think it could work, but I think
I can share with you this. I've done it on a cover story. I've done it on a form of a cover story. So,
please
like a
share.
magazine. I can share that. I can share that.
Roz, would you like to share yours? I will say that we have just a couple of minutes, so can I ask you if you do want to share, to do like a quick share?
Sure, I can do it in one sentence.
Okay.
What I wrote there is actually sort of a glimpse into a methodology that I use when I help people go through difficult things that they, it's unsurmountable, it's difficult, we can't do this, there's going to be so many problems. So the method, I call it the doomsday simulation method. So what I do is I invite people to take whatever it is that's this huge problem they have to solve, and walk them through, coach them to go through what is the doomsday, and what is the worst case scenario that you can imagine that's going to happen, every possible failure that's going to happen. And once they confront that and we document it, write it down, draw it out, then we go through one by one the probability of each one of those things happening. And in the end, when you can kind of do this checklist of, oh, that probability is only 20%, that probability, and you just go through it, the dopamine you get from just going through that exercise helps people to face whatever the difficulties, and then we can move forward to actually surmount whatever things that you have to go through. So that's it. I just wanted to share that there is a methodology to get over those negative vibes.
Is this something that you've published or shared somewhere, and are there resources you'd be willing to share on it?
I'm actually having a session coming up soon. That's a public session that I can encourage you to join in.
Yeah, if you can share the details,
Yeah.
It sounds really interesting and really relevant to sort of how we think about the future. Because if we have faculty and institutions sort of applying the doomsday simulation to what does the future of teaching look like, and then sort of one thing that our institution is doing is a lot of micro-credentials, corporatization. So looking at, okay, what does this actually mean? What's going to be lost? So I think that could have a lot of applications. I'd be very interested to learn more.
Well, I think I run a monthly session called Brave Space, and I believe there's one more session coming up that I have invited MyFest to join with that session. So you're welcome to join it. Yasser, if you